session, we'll be discussing prophecy and the Ukraine conflict. Bible prophecy is one of my favorite topics because it's in the Bible, which is my favorite book for good reason. Ukraine is where I happen to live, and the Ukraine conflict is very big right now in the discussions that are happening around and about. So I think that the unfortunate situation that be is an opportunity for us to practice worldview thinking, right? So I thought it would be good to discuss three basic things here. First of all, the biblical data surrounding the Gog-Magog war. Short version, this is not the Gog-Magog war, but there are some similarities, and what is happening today could very well contribute to the world situation that is going to have the Gog-Magog war. So we're going to look at what the biblical data says. Then we're going to discuss some principles for discerning current events. And then we're going to take a look at the Ukraine conflict as it is going on. Okay, so the biblical data. The Gog-Magog war is discussed in Ezekiel 38. Here's verses 1 through 6. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against them. And say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and lead you out with all your army, horses, and horsemen, all splendidly clothed, a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya are with them, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer and all its troops, the house of Togarmah from the far north, and all its troops, many people are with you. Let's see. Then 39, starting in 1b. Behold, I am against you, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. And I will turn you around and lead you on, bringing you up from the far north, and bring you against the mountains of Israel. Then I will knock the bow out of your hand, and cause the arrows to fall out of your right hand. You shall fall upon the mountains of Israel, you and all your troops, and the peoples who are with you. I will give to you birds of prey, and every sort, and to the beast of the fields to be devoured. You shall fall upon the open field, for I have spoken, says the Lord God. And I will send fire on Magog, and on those who live in security in the coastlands. Then they shall know that I am the Lord. Then later it goes on to describe that for 7 months the house of Israel will be burying them in order to cleanse the land. This is in the book of Ezekiel. Now, is Ezekiel in the Old Testament or the New Testament? Old, right? Which is a division I don't like to make. I like talking about Hebrew scriptures and Greek scriptures. It's all the Bible. It's not like the Old Testament is old and outdated. No, it's still very much relevant. God said this would happen in the Old Testament. It hasn't happened yet, so we know it will happen. Revelation is in the Greek scriptures. It came a bit later, right? This is the last book of the Bible that we received. There, it talks about this. Revelation 6:3-4 says, When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, Come and see. Another horse, fiery red, went out, and it granted to the people who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword. Now, this is descriptive of the tribulation period. Later in the book of Revelation, we see this in chapter 20. Now, when the 1,000 years have expired, so after the tribulation, at the end of the Messianic kingdom, Satan will be released from his prison, and he will go out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth. The four quadrants. He's not saying the earth is a square here. Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea. Okay, so we just looked at 4 Bible passages. This is a dispensationalist church, which means we love Bible charts, right? So here's a timeline that we could put the things that we just looked at. It seems that we are having a couple of conflicts here that are being identified with Gog and Magog. The first one is in Ezekiel 38. In Ezekiel 39, we see a 7-month cleanup going on. If we put on our timeline the tribulation, the rapture, the second coming, and the millennium, and we can align it like this. We have the rapture, which comes before the tribulation. The tribulation is a 7-year period. During the tribulation, we are going to have seal judgments. We saw in that passage in Revelation 6 that there is a second seal judgment, which is going to be war coming out. Now, there are excellent theologians who are also dispensationalists, who read the Bible very much in the same way that we do. And we might disagree with some of the details here, but I would tend to think that the Gog-Magog war that we read about in Ezekiel 38 aligns with this seal judgment in the first half of the tribulation. Then we get the second coming, after which Israel is still cleaning up for 7 months, after all the mess there. Then at the end of the tribulation, we have another war that is called Gog-Magog. So it's like Gog-Magog 2. Kind of like we have World War I and World War II. There's going to be Gog-Magog 1 and Gog-Magog 2. Gog-Magog are territories that are fairly fixed, and I think they'll be around for quite a while. Let's talk about the parties who are involved. We have Meshech, Togarmah, Gomer, and Tubal. I think that we can identify those with being territories that are in modern-day Turkey. It's a little bit difficult because these are names that are written in Hebrew that have fallen a little bit into obscurity. Whenever God spoke to Ezekiel, he would have known precisely where these guys are. Some would try to argue that Meshech is Moscow, or that some of these other towns are cities around Russia. I think there's a good case to be made for them being within Anatolia of antiquity, around Turkey. Persia is Iran. Put, Libya, that's a pretty solid connection. Cush is Sudan, Ethiopia, that realm. Understand that borders have shifted a little bit since the days of Ezekiel. And there's also Magog, whom I would tend to think is Central Asia. And then the text also, if you notice, mentioned many peoples with you, which are undefined. So it could be people from all over the world that are gathering together. Rosh is another belligerent in this war. We'll get to him in a little bit. So this international coalition of different nations is one day going to rise up, and they're going to charge on Israel. And they're going to get their butts kicked too. Not the first time Israel has been outnumbered. Israel happens to have a covenant with God, so it's not a good idea to try to take them on. Okay, we'll talk about Rosh in a moment, but this is the depiction that I think we're getting out of the Bible. That all these countries are going to rise up against Israel, and that it's likely going to happen on 2 different occasions. Now, before we get too wrapped up in the weeds about current events, let's lay out a couple of rules of engagement for how we look at current events. Do we want to get our worldview including our political worldview, from the Bible, the Word of God, given by a perfect God, entirely without error? Or do we want to get our worldview from millennials with journalism degrees? We want to get it from the Bible. Okay? The Bible is our authority, not theologians who are telling us what the Bible says. The Bible is our authority, not the journalists trying to tell us what's happening. Okay? Another interesting aspect that we must not understate is that Satan is not omniscient. Satan has the same Bible that we have. He was around when it was being written. He is dead set against us having a biblical worldview. So if he can use the theologians and the news to try to get us to derail from our biblical worldview, he will do so. Okay? However, he is not omniscient. He is very smart, probably smarter than all of us combined. But he's not omniscient, right? He doesn't know when the rapture is going to be. Since he doesn't know when the rapture is going to be, he doesn't know when the tribulation is going to be. Since he doesn't know when the tribulation is going to be, he doesn't know when the seal judgments are going to be. He doesn't know when the Messianic kingdom is coming. He doesn't know when the end of the Messianic kingdom is coming. So I think it's reasonable to think that Satan could always be kind of on the edge of his chair, if you will. Always thinking, okay, I need to be ready because I know I'm going to have a Gog-Magog war. I don't know when it's going to be. So it could be that Satan is constantly invested in having people in play that he could try to manipulate into charging Israel in a Gog-Magog war. Does that concept make sense? Okay. So just because Satan is actively trying to get prepared for Gog-Magog tomorrow because he doesn't know when the rapture will be, it doesn't necessarily mean that Gog-Magog is tomorrow. It could just happen to look that way because Satan is not omniscient. Another aspect to remember, geopolitical situations change very quickly, right? The world was a lot different on September 10th than it was September 12th, right? Things change. We've had other big political instances around the world, but September 11th is the one that Americans typically identify with. So just because things look a certain way today doesn't mean that they can't change tomorrow. We want to be very careful about trying to dogmatically say, oh, this is lining up for the Gog-Magog war, and then boop, the geopolitical situation changes, and we're having to backtrack while everybody's sitting back saying, oh, look, you tried to set a date for the rapture, and it didn't happen, right? So we want to be very careful about that. Another thing is that catastrophic events can cause very significant changes, right? If we're anticipating that the rapture is going to come before the Gog-Magog war, do you think that the rapture might change a thing or two in the geopolitical landscape? Absolutely, right? I mean, we saw what happened when a couple of planes crashed into some towers. That was huge. But it's nothing compared to what's going to happen when every believer on the face of the planet is removed, right? It's going to collapse a lot of institutions, right? There are believers in very powerful positions. Granted, Congress is probably going to be okay. But a lot of institutions do have Christians. Oh, I'm kidding. I'm not trying to pick on the congressmen out there, right? Even congressmen can be saved if they believe in Jesus, right? And there are some good guys in politics. But whenever you remove all of the believers, that's a big change, right? So even if the world didn't look at all like we would be heading toward any kind of catastrophe, even if there was complete peace between Russians and everybody else that they're against, even if China was like, you know what, this whole communist thing isn't working out, let's become the good guys now, it could all change with the rapture, okay? So we want to be very careful whenever we're looking at current events, especially whenever we're looking at what the Bible says and how current events look like they could be going in that direction, right? I have some teachers whom I love that like to say, the world isn't falling apart. Things are falling into place, right? It's like a chessboard where everything is moving directly as God would have it. But we don't want to get overly zealous and look at the little pieces and say, this is definitely that, because things can still change. Okie dokie. That said, this is not the Gog-Magog war. What's happening between Russia and Ukraine right now, okay? Ukraine is not Israel. So Russia's violence against the Ukrainian people is not that which is described in Ezekiel. That would be a very weird replacement theology. Replacement theology is this idea that God is done with the Jews. He's only working with us. A lot of bad theology comes out of that. Replacing the Jews with Ukraine, that's even weirder. However, while this is not the Gog-Magog war, it could be setting the stage. There could be things happening right now that would align very well with this future coalition that Satan is going to use to try to attack Israel in the future. So let's take a look at that. I want to look at 4 points. First of all, what is Rosh and what is Russia? A lot of people identify those two together. I think there's a good case to be made. Then we'll take a look at multipolarity and Neo-Eurasianism, the ideology that Putin is using. We'll take a look at the alliance in the Bible, and we'll take a look at whom Russia is forming alliances with today. And then we'll take a look at why Rosh is going to invade Israel and what Israel's current status is today. Okay, so there was a person who made the following comments about the escalation of the war in Ukraine. This person said, so Ukraine is a country in Europe. It exists next to another country called Russia. Russia is a bigger country. Russia is a powerful country. Russia decided to invade a smaller country called Ukraine, so basically that's wrong. So, who said this? Does anyone know? Was it Big Bird? Did you get this? It was the Vice President Kamala Harris. Oh my goodness gracious. This is representative of some of the news that we're getting here in the West relating to this. Kind of uninformed and unintelligent, right? Let's back up a little bit. There's a thought that there was a war that started between Russia and Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. That is false. This is just a new stage of a war. The initial invasion of Ukraine started back in 2014. So this is year 2 of a war that's been going on now for 9 years. That's actually centuries long in its development. So originally we had Kiev Rus. Kiev and Rus was a territory that had Kiev as its capital. This is a map of it after the death of Yaroslav I in 1054. Moscow was not particularly a powerhouse back then. Within time, there were some power shifts. Kiev, being located where it is, was under a lot of stress from surrounding authorities. And with time, Moscow sort of rose to prominence and expanded further and further and further out. Above, this is a map of the Soviet Union as it was in the days of the Soviet Union. Then it collapsed. Here's a map of all of the countries that came out of that. There are distinctions between several countries here. People often, especially for those of us that were raised during the Cold War, there tends to be a thought that there's this one giant blob that is Russia. Actually, Russia is a newer state that came after Ukraine and has been in rebellion against Ukraine for its entire existence. Eastern Orthodoxy came to Ukraine in the 900s or so, and the Russian Orthodox Church is basically a church plant of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that went very, very wrong. Now, to be clear, Eastern Orthodoxy is a false religion, so you should be careful in calling it a church plant in the first place. But Russian Orthodoxy is a cult of Eastern Orthodoxy that is basically a propaganda machine for Putin. We can look at that a little bit more later. When we look at our money, we typically have presidents or Benjamin Franklin on our dollars, right? This is in memory of those who have led America. Ukraine isn't like that. Whenever you look at the Ukrainian currency, we have poets and authors. These are often martyrs who died to preserve the Ukrainian language. Russia has been on a mission to destroy Ukrainian culture, language, and people for centuries now. Okay? I tend to think that this is related to Satan's lack of omniscience. He does not know when the Gog-Magog war will be, so he is constantly invested in having Russia as a violent superpower, trying to conquer that around it so that it can be positioned to have its best shot against Israel in the Gog-Magog war. Because Satan is stupid like that. As intelligent as he is, he's got this goofy idea, and he always has, that he can somehow try to topple God. It's outrageous. Now, if you look at older lexicographers, often whenever we hear people speaking about Gog-Magog today, they'll say, we think that it is Russia. And they'll often say, well, you might be thinking that I'm saying that it's Russia because Russia is currently in the news. However, if you go back to the 1800s, you can see even then that lexicographers were saying that Rosh is Russia. So it's not just about modern events. And I'm like, well, even back then, Russia was the bad guy. It has always been the bad guy. But typically, older lexicographers will say that Rosh is the land that is north of the Black Sea. At the time, some of them would say that is Russia, but that's not quite right. Here's a map of the conflict in Ukraine. It's a couple months old now. Lines have moved a bit. This is the Black Sea. Now, if Rosh is the territory that is north of the Black Sea, what would that make it? Ukraine, right? And it happens that the territory that Russia has been trying to take ever since 2014 is what? Crimea in the Black Sea, as well as the Donetsk and Luhansk territories, which they have formed into the pseudo-republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. And the recent escalation has been pushing this area further into the west. The green is their failed blitzkrieg on Kiev. They attempted to take the capital, but since the Ukrainian military is inferior to the Ukrainian people, they failed. Okay, so that's kind of where Russia is. That's kind of the territory that they're trying to take. They're trying to conquer this bit that's north of the Black Sea. If we look at the text in Hebrew, Greek, and Old Church Slavonic is kind of like the Latin for Slavic branches of Eastern Orthodoxy. And we look at Ezekiel 38:2, and we look at the word Rosh. In Hebrew, it is Rosh. In Greek, it is Ros. And in Old Church Slavonic, it is Rusi. It has this funny letter right here, which is kind of like a U, and this funny miyaki znak. It's a letter that makes the S kind of funny. If we look at the Hebrew, what we have is an aleph with a dot over it, which is the dot is what makes it an O as opposed to an A or another sound. So it's got a particularly interesting vowel there. And it has sin, which is a particularly interesting kind of a letter S. So it's R, kind of interesting O, and then kind of interesting S. Well, it's the same over here. It's R, kind of interesting O or U, and then kind of interesting S. So it seems that perhaps older interpreters who were translating into Greek and Old Church Slavonic sort of saw a connection there. By the way, the vowel is a little bit different in the Old Church Slavonic from the word Rusi, as in Kiev Rus. Okay, that's a lot of boring linguistics. Let's get through the linguistics really quickly. Blah, blah, blah. It comes from Old Church Slavonic, Proto-Finnic, blah, 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 Proto-Finnic language, blah, 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 blah. That's where it was all spoken, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now, linguistics aside, I sometimes nerd out on linguistics. It says that it was north of where Ezekiel was, right? Now, Ezekiel being a prophet here in Babylon, if he was to turn north, he would look up, and it would be right up through the Caucasus region up to Moscow, if you will. Now, you might be thinking, but wait a minute, you said that Moscow did not come to prominence until the 1100s AD. This was before Christ, right? Well, yes. However, just because Moscow was not prominent does not mean it was not present. There are archaeological artifacts that attest to Bronze Age sites in the Moscow region. Ezekiel would have been an Iron Age prophet. So whenever Ezekiel prophesied, Moscow would have been active. Okay. Would it have been known? Well, presumably if God was speaking specifically of Moscow, then Ezekiel would have known. If he's speaking more broadly about Rus or Rus, then it's possible that they were already active, as seen in the archaeology, and that is what Ezekiel would have thought about. So, in other words, there's no reason to think that there's no way Ezekiel would have thought about Russia. It's very well within the range of archaeological and linguistic possibilities. Okie dokie. Okay, cool. So, what is Rosh? What is Russia? I think that they are one and the same. Granted, the boundaries and territories have moved around a little bit, and Russia is trying to expand today. What is multipolarity? What is Neo-Eurasianism? So this is the topic that I'm wanting to write my dissertation on. I've been doing some research on it. This is the ideology that Putin is working with. The Bible prescribes national distinctions. Different countries have their borders, and governments have their responsibilities within the borders. The globalists, the leftists, want to dissolve borders and have one big global government. That's not very realistic in the current age. Eventually, whenever we get into the tribulation, we're going to have a one world government. They're working that way. I think that Putin's ideology is a little bit more reasonable to the same evil end. Instead of trying to have one big government, he's trying to collapse it into a handful of governments so that we have giant land masses. There's a quote in which he supports this ideology. The political philosophy is developed most by Alexander Dugin, who is currently working on his 28th volume on this garbage. In so many words, they want to turn the world into several big spaces instead of having a whole lot of smaller nations. So Moscow is supposed to control this whole entire area here, including Central Asia, which I think is aligned with Magog, as well as Ukraine. One of the problems is that nobody knows exactly how to draw all of the borders, right? So that's Russia's idea. We need to break the world into a dozen or so big poles, while the other side, the leftists, are saying, no, we need one global government, one currency. Hence the World Economic Forum constantly trying to bully Ukraine into joining their globalist agenda, while Russia is trying to bully them into the multipolarity agenda. But what does the Bible say? That both of those are evil. We need a multinational agenda. Okie dokie. Okay, that was a whole lot of political philosophy really quickly. Now, we've looked at Rosh and Russia. Let's get back to the Bible. What is the alliance in the Bible? And with whom is Russia currently aligning? We saw the map earlier of all those different bodies, and the Gog-Magog war is an attack against Israel. Now it's interesting that, especially since the escalation that occurred in 2022, a whole lot of Jews from Israel are making Aliyah. They're getting out of Ukraine and relocating back to Israel. This is to be expected, right? We anticipate that more Jews are going to continue to return to Israel. What's more, as you follow Russian propaganda channels, you might notice a lot of anti-Semitism coming out. If you are following Russian propaganda, hopefully you're not. I am. I'm trying to stay in touch with what it is that Russia is doing ideologically in order to refute them. And here are some stickers on an app called Telegram that a lot of Russian propaganda uses to promote their ideology. Despicable, disgusting depictions of Jews, right? Accusing them of being shapeshifters. All of the classic anti-Semitic attacks that were being made against Israel and Jews back in like the World War II days have returned into the modern anti-Semitism that is Russian propaganda. So we look at these bodies. We saw a reason to say that Rosh is Russia. We anticipate that they're going to grow to ally with Central Asia as well as Iran, Libya, and Kush and Turkey. What's actually happening? Earlier this year, back in February, Vladimir Putin did a presidential address, kind of like our State of the Union, in which he very explicitly said, we will develop Black Sea and Sea Azov ports. We will pay special attention to North-South International Corridor, blah, blah, blah. Vessels with draft pass through the Volga, Caspian Sea Canal this year. We will open up new routes for business cooperation with India, Iran, Pakistan, and Middle Eastern countries. We'll continue developing this corridor, right? So we see him developing relationships with Iran, with Persia, the very countries that are being laid out. Oh, by the way, more recently, have you been following the news about Niger, about the conflict and the revolution there, which is kind of a divide between the so-called Christian nations of Western Africa and the Muslim nations? Russia has become very vested in siding with the Muslim nations against the Christian nations, right? It's as if a giant axis of anti-Semitism is already beginning to develop. They're breeding anti-Semitism amongst their readership. They're forming alliances with countries that are anti-Semitic, anti-Israel. It's aligning very well. Now, why does the Bible say that Rosh is going to invade Israel? It said that the reason was to plunder, to take booty, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, to take great plunder, right? That's the idea. Okay, well, how is Israel's economy doing compared to the belligerents? Here are some charts showing their gross domestic product. And Israel is way significantly more wealthier than Russia and its allies, right? In fact, the gross domestic product of Russia is comparative to that of Florida, okay? I think part of the reason is that they restrict freedom against business. And they have oligarchs that come in, and they have serious problems with corruption because it's post-Soviet, right? Very difficult to have a good GDP after that. You can have a few people get rich. So we're seeing then that Israel is becoming wealthy while their enemies are not. So that would provide the motivation for coming in and plundering. We're seeing the alliances form just as we would expect. So what are some potential conclusions there? I think it is very possible that Russia is indeed the Rosh that we read about in the Bible that is going to invade Israel during the tribulation in the Gog-Magog war. We see that Russia is currently aligning nations against Israel. And not just against Israel, but against the West as a whole. You are deluded if you are an American who does not understand that Russia is your enemy. Okay? Of course, they would be enemies of America, though. America and Israel have traditionally been allies. Granted, we have a current administration that's trying to destroy that. So Russia is currently aligning nations against Israel. If the rapture is soon, then Russia and her allies could attack Israel. Right? Presumably, the rapture would probably destroy America more than it would a lot of other countries, just because we have so much more freedom here for the gospel to spread. Right? If we remove all of the Christians from earth, that's going to hurt America a lot more than it is the Muslim world. Okay? So keep preaching your Muslim friends. We don't want them to have to go through that. But if the rapture does happen soon, then Russia could already be aligned in a very good position to attack Israel and get its butt kicked. The genocide in Ukraine, in conclusion, could be a satanic ploy that will eventually lead to the fulfillment of Ezekiel 39. But that's not today. So it could be that Russia is trying to storm Ukraine as a satanic plan to try to strengthen Rosh and to strengthen the alliance with the other nations in the Gog-Magog alliance in order to attack Israel. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. Notice we're using the word could be here, right? A lot of stuff could change tomorrow. Okay. Very good. We just looked at the Bible. We looked at some theories, some possibilities. So what? Gonna get out, leave this parking lot, and go back to my sinful life of smoking dope and beating up Christians or whatever it is that you people typically do throughout the week, right? No. There are some very serious applications to the geopolitical world that I think we can carry over to our lives. Number one, support Israel. Okay? As we saw in our first lesson, God has a specific, distinct relationship with Israel. And it's that relationship that Satan is trying to attack. So often, whenever we have serious geopolitical conflicts way on the other side of the planet that don't seem to affect us all that much in America, often there's an Israel aspect to it. So we should support Israel. Is Israel perfect? No. There are legitimate criticisms to be made of Israel. And we can make those criticisms because Israel is a free country and America is a free country, right? Countries like Russia are the ones that you get pushed out of windows for criticizing. So support Israel. Criticize Russia. Fight anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is opposition against the Jewish people, the very people that God has cut a covenant with, right? What is the most anti-Semitic thing you can do? Share the gospel with a Jew. All right. Third, support Ukraine. But I repeat myself, because if you're supporting Israel, then you're naturally going to support Ukraine. It is no coincidence that Russia is using Iranian suicide drones to murder Ukrainian civilians. But why did Iran develop suicide drones? Was it to murder Ukrainian citizens? No, they developed that technology to murder Jews in Israel. Okay? Russia is forming a giant axis of anti-Semitism, and currently Ukraine is the focus of it. But it would be very easy to shift it to Israel. So, support Ukraine. Most importantly, we must remember that we are living on borrowed time. The Lord could return at any moment. And whenever we see these things, we can cook up theories about how this may or may not relate to end-time prophecies. But either way, the Gog-Magog war is not something that we are going to be here to experience because the rapture is going to come first. And we might die before the rapture. We don't have a bazillion years to get around to evangelizing later, okay? Remember that we are living on borrowed time, so live as if the Lord is going to return today. Okie dokie. What do I typically do? Am I supposed to do an altar call, or do I just pray and get out of here? Oh, okay. All right, I'll lead us in prayer then.